In this talk, we are looking at internet outages caused by censorship efforts. In particular, those taking place at the country level. So these are intentional outages intended to prevent or limit communication by the population. There have been repeated instances of these censorship outages over the last few years, and in this paper, we're not discussing the most recent of those. However, we're using this paper because it provides a very thorough analysis of the technical details of how the censorship took place, and provides a methodology for observing the outage. As with other talks, we have the slides provided by the authors of the original paper. At a high level, we're talking about macroscopic internet events, and we're going to be using multiple different data sources to analyze them. One of these is a network telescope, which is a subnet that has no live hosts on it, so any traffic going to that subnet is, by definition, unsolicited and allows us to characterize internet background radiation. In the past, network telescopes have enabled us to study denial of service activity, as well as the spread of numerous scanning worms. In this talk, we'll be studying the internet events surrounding protests in Egypt and Libya at the beginning of 2011. In the case of Egypt, the government ordered an internet shutdown a couple days after the protests began, and it lasted for over 5 days. And in the case of Libya, there were multiple distinct outages, with the longest lasting almost 4 days. There's a substantial difference between the scope of the internet infrastructure in these two countries, with Egypt having over 4,000 advertised prefixes managed by 51 different autonomous systems, and Libya having only 13 IPv4 prefixes and 3 autonomous systems. However, the technical approaches used for filtering observed in Libya are much more varied than those observed in Egypt. While BGP was used in both cases, Libya also used packet filtering and satellite signal jamming. So let's see how this was all observed. The authors combined data sources from BGP. These are the BGP updates that are continuously collected by RIPE NCC and route views. Then there's active traceroute probing. This occurs continuously using Chiesa's ARC infrastructure. And then there is the internet background radiation collected by the UCSD network telescope. So note that all of these data sources are long-lived ongoing collections. They were not collected specifically for this work. But after the events occurred, researchers were able to go back and study the data that was being collected anyway. To determine what IP addresses and prefixes actually belong to these countries, they used two sources of information. One is the delegations from the Afrinic RIR, and the other is the MaxMind Geolite geolocation database. Then they look at BGP to see what is actually being advertised out of these geolocated ranges. Going forward, whenever the authors mention a particular AS, they're specifically talking about the IPs of that AS that are associated with a country of interest. So an autonomous system certainly might have a presence in multiple countries, but they're just talking about the part of that AS that has a presence in Egypt and Libya. So the first analysis is looking at BGP advertisements, and we see that the vast majority of the prefixes advertised through BGP were withdrawn in a fairly coordinated manner. Remember, we're looking at Egypt here, and they had 51 different ASs advertising prefixes, so there must have been no small effort in getting all of those to participate in withdrawing at about the same time. The authors note here that the IPv6 prefixes were effectively ignored. They were not withdrawn in this process. Looking at 6 of the most significant ASs, we can see that they did coordinate and withdraw around the same time, as well as when they began re-advertising the prefixes again. And one interesting thing to note is that the AS level topology changed permanently. So the before topology and the after topology are different. So even after the routes were restored, the topology did not return to its former state. We see that before, most of the paths went through what they're calling International AS4, whereas afterwards, most of the paths go through International AS2. Now we're looking at the events from the perspective of the network telescope. So while legitimate internet traffic requires bidirectional routes to be in place, meaning to establish a connection, traffic has to be able to flow in both directions. On the other hand, this background radiation is coming from infected hosts that are just sending out traffic and not expecting a response back. And so we see that even during the shutdown, there continued to be this background radiation coming from these ASs in Egypt. So while they had withdrawn the routes for traffic to get to Egypt, there was still a data plane path for packets to leave Egypt and get to the rest of the internet, and in particular the UCSD network telescope. And we also see that that traffic continued to have the normal diurnal pattern that we expect as computers are turned on during the daytime and shut off at night. With Libya, on the other hand, we see a range of different behaviors, including backscatter from 2 different denial of service attacks targeted at hosts in Libya, and also a nearly complete shutoff of data plane traffic leaving the network during the outage labeled C. Breaking down the traffic observed from Egypt, we see that the majority of it was the scanning worm traffic from Configure or similar worms. And then there's also a significant amount of backscatter. However, most of that went away during the outage. Overlaying the BGP advertisement measurements with the telescope measurements, we see that they align exactly in the case of this Egyptian AS. However, in the case of Libya, we can see that these measurements are complementary, because in the highlighted section, we have the BGP routes being withdrawn, but then returned shortly afterwards. However, at the data plane, clearly the outage lasted much longer. So here it's showing us two different techniques being used. One at the control plane, BGP, and one at the data plane, packet filtering. We then look at the ARC data. We've mentioned the ARC platform before. This is the one that cycles through all advertised /24s in the internet and conducts trace routes to those targets. However, it takes a significant amount of time for this to take place, so a particular prefix may only be measured once every day or two. So we see a general correlation between the ARC active measurements with the outages that we identified from BGP and the telescope. However, two of the short Libyan outages are not visible in this data. Also, we note that the ARC measurements are designed to identify topology. However, in this case, they're just being used to analyze reachability because it does take a bidirectional working path to complete these traceroute measurements. ARC was able to confirm what we saw from the telescope, that there was a significant outage even while the BGP reachability was up. So for the outage designated as C, BGP was withdrawn but then returned. However, actual connectivity to the country was not restored for several days. Another very interesting result is that there was an international AS that provided satellite internet connectivity to Libya. And so in that case, the BGP routes were not withdrawn, but the traffic itself stopped arriving at the telescope. And this seems to imply that signal jamming was used to prevent the Libyan population from using this form of internet connectivity during the outage. So in the case of Libya, then we have control plane, data plane, and physical layer techniques being used to censor traffic. So in this paper, we gained some insight into the technical details behind these geopolitical events. And we hope that was helpful, and we'll see you on the next one. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it to be useful, please click the like button. To be notified when more videos are posted for this class, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell.